You did everything right. Same lake, the same point off the same weed line that held fish all last week. Same lure, same knot. And today, the water might as well be empty. Not a tap, not a follow, nothing. So you do what every angler does. You go looking for the reason. And the reason the whole world hands you, the forums, the apps, the guy at the boat ramp, is one word: pressure. The barometer dropped, or it spiked, and the fish can feel it hours before you can, and when it moves, they shut their mouths and lie on the bottom and refuse to eat. I believed that for years. I wrote it in the margins of my own notebooks. Skunked, pressure falling, as if those three words explained anything at all. Then I started checking. Not the bite, the number. I lined up years of pages, date, time, what the sky did, what came over the side of the boat, against what the barometer was actually doing on each of those days. And the story those pages told was not the story I had been sold. The barometer is the one thing nearly everyone tells you to watch, and it is very close to the one thing that matters least. That sounds backwards, so let's push on it, hard. Because once you see why the pressure obsession survives, why it is everywhere, why it sells, why almost no one profits from telling you the truth, you stop reading the water the way you were taught. You start reading it the way the fish actually live in it. The fish aren't gone. They're not sulking over 1/10 of an inch of mercury. They're doing something far simpler and far more useful to you if you know what to look for. We'll get to exactly what, but first, you need to know why the wrong answer is always the one that reaches you. Walk into any tackle shop, open any fishing app, and count how many things are built to sell you the weather. The app with the little barometer graph and the colored bite bar. The fish finder with the pressure trend on the home screen. The lure sold as the answer for a falling barometer, and the other lure sold as the answer for a high one. Now ask a quieter question. What do all of those things have in common? They're products. Every one of them is something a company can build, box, and sell you again next season in a new color. Here's the part nobody says out loud. The real skill, reading the sky, the wind, the water itself, costs nothing. You can't patent it. You can't hang it on a peg hook. You can't sell a man the same sunrise twice. An industry built on your next purchase has no reason to teach you the one thing that would make you stop buying. So the pressure story gets repeated because it comes with a price tag. And the free skill, the one that actually puts fish in the boat, gets left in the margins, where it doesn't earn anybody a dollar. Hear me clearly. Nobody is lying to you in a back room. There's no conspiracy. It is simpler and colder than that. The market sells what the market can package, and it cannot package the sky. That is why most anglers walk around watching the one number that is easiest to sell and hardest to use. Not because they're careless, because that answer was put in front of them, over and over, until it felt like science. So let's take the number apart. Let's find out what a falling barometer really does to a fish, measured in the only thing a fish cares about, which is pressure on its own body. Because once you see that, you'll understand how a base can shrug off an entire thunderstorm without a flinch. Start with what pressure even is. The air above you has weight. Stack up the whole column of atmosphere, and at sea level it presses down at about 14 7/10 pounds on every square inch. On the gauge, that's right around 29.92 inches of mercury. Weather nudges that number. A storm shaves a little off. A clear high pushes it up. A little. That word is the whole story. Now picture where the fish lives. Not in air, in water. And water is heavy, roughly 800 times denser than air. Here's the single fact that ends the argument. You only have to go down about 33 feet in water to double the pressure on your body. The entire weight of the sky, matched by 33 feet of water. So run that on a fish. A bass holding on a point rises a foot to look at your bait, then settles back. In that little move, it just put itself through a bigger, faster pressure change than the largest cold front of the year will ever deliver at the surface. A whole storm system might shift the barometer 6/100ths of an atmosphere over many hours. A fish erases that, and more, by swimming up the length of your arm. This is not my theory. Dr. David Ross spent his career as a scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, one of the most respected ocean research centers in the world, and he has written about exactly this for anglers. His conclusion is blunt. next to the pressure changes a fish makes just by living, swimming, feeding, chasing. The change from the barometer is trivial. Most fish, he says, probably aren't even aware it moved. And no fish on Earth can predict the future. So why does the bite still die when the weather turns? Because something real is changing on those days. It is just not the number on the gauge. The barometer isn't a lever reaching into the lake to shut the fish down. It's a clock on the wall. When it moves, it is telling you the weather is about to change. The light, the wind, the temperature, the water itself. The fish aren't reacting to the clock. They're reacting to what the clock announces. Which raises the obvious question. If a fish can't read a barometer, and it can't, how does it read the water at all? Because it does, constantly, with a sense you don't have and have probably never been told the truth about. Run your hand down the side of almost any fish and you'll feel a faint line, head to tail. Most people never think about it. That line is one of the most remarkable sense organs in the animal world, and it's why a fish can hunt in muddy water, in the dark, packed into a tight school, without bumping a single neighbor. Picture standing blindfolded in a quiet room, and someone walks past you. You feel the air move. You know where they are without seeing them. A fish feels the water that way, over its whole body, all the time. A sense of touch that reaches out into the water around it. It's called the lateral line. Down that faint stripe sit tiny clusters of hair cells, the same kind that line your own inner ear, and they bend when water moves against them. Current, vibration, the flick of a baitfish tail 20 feet off. Researchers like Horst Bleckmann at the University of Bonn have spent decades showing how fish build a picture of their entire world out of moving water. A fish, in a real sense, sees with its skin. Now here's where the popular story gets it wrong, and it matters. You'll hear that the lateral line is how a fish feels the barometer, how it senses a storm hours away. It doesn't. The lateral line reads water moving near the fish, right now. It is not a barometer. It cannot feel the slow, faint weight of the atmosphere on a lake. And honestly, the truth is better than the myth. A fish isn't a tiny weather station forecasting next week's front. It is a live, exquisite motion detector, locked onto the water moving around it this instant. That is not a downgrade. That is the thing you can use. Because everything that genuinely turns a bite on or off works by changing the water the fish feels, and the body it feels with. Which brings us to the factor the gauge watchers ignore, the one that actually decides whether a fish is hungry or shut down on any given day. It isn't pressure, it's heat, and the way heat moves through water is going to change how you pick your hours for the rest of your fishing life. A fish can't warm itself. Whatever the water's temperature is, that is the fish's temperature. Its whole engine, how fast it digests, how hard it hunts, whether it even wants to eat, runs on the heat of the water around it. Cold water, slow engine. Warm water, fast engine. Up to a point. And here's the trap on the warm end, the one almost nobody connects. Warm water holds less oxygen. Not a little less, meaningfully less. And at the very same moment the water carries less oxygen, the fish's revved-up body is demanding more of it. That gap, between what the fish needs and what the water can give, is the real reason a lake goes dead on a baking August afternoon. The fish isn't sulking. It's suffocating, a little, and backing off to survive. That is the master switch, not the barometer. Heat. And the breath that heat steals out of the water. So let it pick your hours and your spots. The bite isn't random. It tracks the comfortable window. Largemouth bass want it warm. They feed hard through the 70s and slow down as the water falls toward the 40s. Smallmouth like it a touch cooler. Walleye and pike lean cold. Pike gorge in fall as the water slides into the 50s, then sulk and hide once summer climbs past the 70s. Trout want it colder still. Warm water is real stress for a trout, not a preference. Crappie and bluegill ride the middle. Catfish handle heat better than almost anything that swims. See what that list does for you. On a brutal afternoon you don't quit. You change targets. And you change time. Fish the cool edges of the day, first light and last. Fish deeper, where it's cooler. Find moving water, an inflow, a current seam, where oxygen gets stirred back in. Or go hunt the catfish that doesn't care. And remember how slow water is to change. Air can swing 30 degrees in an afternoon. Water barely moves. It takes days of warm weather to lift a lake a couple of degrees, and days of cold to drop it. So the first warm afternoon after a long cold snap is a trap. The air feels like spring, but the water is still locked in winter, and the fish know it even when you don't. That one idea, chase the comfortable water, not the comfortable air, will outfish a barometer app every day of the year. Before we read the wind and the light though, I want to put one thing in your hands. Everything in this video, why the barometer is a clock and not a lever, the temperature window for each fish, what to do when the light is flat or the water turns brown, I've gathered onto a single page you can tape inside your tackle box lid. The cues, the short list of what to stop doing, and the sources, so you can check every claim yourself. Point your phone at the code on screen and it's yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the wind and the light, the next two things we read, are where most anglers go exactly backwards, fishing the easy bank while the fish feed on the hard one. There's an old line anglers have passed down for generations. Wind from the west, fish bite the best. Wind from the east, fish bite the least. It gets repeated like a law of nature. It isn't. But it isn't nonsense either. And the truth underneath it is worth more than the rhyme. The direction itself doesn't reach into the water and flip a switch. What it tells you is which way the weather is leaning. Across much of the country, a west or southwest wind rides in ahead of mild, settled weather. An east or north wind often comes with a cold front shoving through. The fish aren't obeying a compass. They're responding to the whole pattern the wind is carrying. Same as the barometer. The wind is a messenger, not the message. But wind does one thing directly, physically, that you can use on every trip. It moves water. And moving water is where the food goes. Picture a light chop on the surface, that gentle broken ripple. Walleye anglers have a name for it, the walleye chop. Here's why they love it. The ripple scatters the sunlight before it reaches the fish. The shallows go dim, and a fish that felt naked under flat, bright, clear water suddenly feels hidden, safe enough to move up and hunt. There's more. Wind pushes the surface across the lake, and everything floating goes with it. Plankton, drifting bugs, the tiny stuff baitfish eat. It piles against whatever shore the wind blows into. The baitfish follow the food. The predators follow the baitfish. The whole chain stacks up on the wind-blown bank. So here's the edge most people get backwards. The comfortable bank, calm, at your back, easy casting, is usually the empty one. The bank with the wind in your face, chop slapping the rocks, is where the food's piled and the fish are feeding. Fish the ugly side. Light works the same way, and it's why a bluebird day is so hard. The front passes, the sky goes cloudless and brilliant, and the fishing falls apart. Not from pressure, from that flat, blazing light pouring into clear water, pinning the fish tight to cover, deep and nervous. On those days you don't power fish. You slow down. Smaller baits, natural colors, lighter line, dragged slow and close, right into the shade where they're hiding. So you can read the wind and the light. But there's a narrow window the best anglers live for, when the fish throw out every bit of caution at once. It opens right before the sky breaks open, and using it, safely, is the difference between a great day and a dangerous one. Most seasoned anglers will tell you the same thing. In the hour or two before a summer thunderstorm, the fish often go on a tear, aggressive, reckless, slamming baits they ignored all morning. It's real. I've got it written down too many times to call it luck. And the popular crowd credits the falling barometer for it. But look at what's actually happening in that window. The clouds stack up, so the flat, pinning light suddenly drops. The wind comes up and shoves bait toward the banks. Every condition that made the fish nervous lifts at once, right as the weather gets ready to turn ugly for a while. They feed ahead of it, not because a needle moved, but because the water and the light just told them the hunting is about to be good and then gone. So use it. If storms are forecast for the afternoon, be on the water early and fish hard as the sky builds. Bigger, faster, louder baits while the feed is on, moving baits that cover water and trigger reaction strikes. That dark, breezy pre-storm window can be the best 30 minutes of the day. And then, this part is not optional. The moment that storm actually arrives, you get off the water. A fishing rod is one of the finest lightning rods ever made. Graphite and carbon conduct electricity, and you'll be standing in the open, on the water, holding one up in the air. People are killed this way every single year. No fish, no window, no bite of a lifetime is worth it. If you can hear thunder, you're already close enough to be struck. Reel up and go. The fish will be there tomorrow. Make sure you are too. So that's the storm window. The gift and the warning, wrapped together. But there's another kind of day that empties the boat ramps, the kind that looks completely hopeless. The water turns brown. And for one fish in particular, that's the dinner bell. Heavy rain moves through, runoff pours in, and the water goes from clear to the color of chocolate milk. For a lot of anglers, that's the end of the trip. And for some fish, they're right. A bass, a pike, a fish that hunts mostly by sight, gets lost in that murk. It can't see the bait. The bite gets tough. But the lake didn't die, it just changed hands. Because there's a whole class of fish that barely uses its eyes to feed, and brown water is exactly when they take over. Think how you'd find food in a pitch-black kitchen, not by looking, by smell, by feel, reaching out and touching. That's a catfish, all the time. And it is not a figure of speech. John Caprio, a neuroscientist at Louisiana State University, who spent his career mapping how a catfish tastes the world, describes something most anglers have never heard. A catfish is, in a real sense, a swimming tongue. Its taste buds aren't only in its mouth, they're scattered across its whole body, tens of thousands of them, down the barbels and along the skin. When the water clouds up and every sight feeder goes blind, the catfish is reading a chemical map of the lake it could follow, with its eyes shut. So muddy water isn't a dead day, it's a change in who's feeding. When the runoff hits, you stop forcing a sight bite and switch your whole approach. Fish slow, on or near the bottom, with a bait that throws a strong scent trail, something a fish can smell its way to. Target the catfish that's now the most confident predator in the lake, and fish the muddy inflows, the stained current lines, where the runoff is washing food in and the catfish are stacked to meet it. That's adapting to the water in front of you, instead of mourning the water you wanted. But there's one last piece of fish biology I have to put in front of you, because it is the one place the swim bladder story is real. It costs fish their lives every season, and almost nobody talks about it. Earlier I told you the barometer barely touches a fish's swim bladder. True, but there's one situation where pressure slams that organ hard and fast, and it's caused by you, not the weather. Hook a fish deep, down past 20 or 30 feet, and reel it up fast, and the pressure on its body drops by a huge amount in seconds. Not the trivial nudge of a passing front, a real, violent change. The gas in its swim bladder expands fast, and the fish can't keep up. And here's where that bit of anatomy finally earns its place. Some fish can dump that gas almost instantly. A trout, a carp, their swim bladder connects straight to the gut, so they can essentially burp the pressure off. The science word is physostome. All you need to remember is, there's a relief valve. Bass, walleye, perch, crappie don't have it. Their bladder is sealed. To shrink it back down, they have to bleed the gas out slowly through the bloodstream, and that takes hours. Pull one up fast from deep water and the bladder stays overinflated. The fish floats helpless, can't swim down, and often dies hours after you watched it swim off looking fine. It's called barotrauma, and it kills released fish you were sure you'd saved. So if you're fishing deep and planning to release, this matters. Bring fish up a little slower when you can. Get them photographed and back in the water fast. And learn the proper way that biologists and many state agencies recommend for getting a deep-caught fish back down to depth, so its bladder can recompress. Because the methods, and what's legal, vary from place to place. Check your state's regulations before you do anything to a fish you mean to release. That's the swim bladder's real story. Not a weather switch, but a release day responsibility. And it points straight at the one habit that ties this whole thing together. The habit that turns all of this from interesting facts into fish in the boat. Go back to the start, to the skunked day, the empty point, and the 3 words I used to scrawl in the margin. Skunked, pressure falling. I want to tell you what actually changed for me, and it wasn't a gadget. It was the page itself. I stopped writing down the excuse and started writing down the facts. 4 of them, every trip, the moment I found feeding fish, the date, the time, the exact spot, and what was happening, the wind, the sky, the water, what they were eating. 4 lines, 10 seconds. Here's why it works. Fish respond to conditions, and conditions repeat. Pull up a free historical weather site, match it to your 4 lines, and you can see the wind and the sky that put fish in your boat on your water. Not a lake 100 miles away, yours. Do it for a season, and you stop guessing. You start recognizing the good days before they arrive. That's the whole secret nobody can sell you. Not a number on a screen, a page, in your own hand, about your own water. So here's where it leaves you. The barometer didn't change between last week and today. Same air, same sky. What changed is that you can now read the things that actually moved. The heat, the light, the wind, the water. And you know which way the fish moved with them. You can see the comfortable window the gauge watchers are blind to. The wall of advice will keep pointing at the barometer, because the barometer comes in a box with a price on it. You're one of the few who knows where to look instead. If you'd rather fish knowing what the tackle aisle won't tell you, subscribe, and we'll keep pulling the rest of it back into the light, one quiet truth at a time. Keep your own page. The water has been writing it the whole time. All you have to do is learn to read it.